The crimson sunset painted the vast Montana sky as Nora Sullivan clutched her swollen belly and stared at the locked door of her childhood home, the echo of her father's final words still ringing in her ears. "No daughter of mine carries a bastard child." Tears streaked down her dirt-smudged face, her meager belongings stuffed into a single carpet bag as she faced the cruel reality of being 19, pregnant, and utterly alone in the unforgiving frontier of 1878. Nora's trembling fingers clutched the edge of her shawl tighter as the autumn wind whipped through the small mining town of Silver Creek. Her father, the town's respected minister, had made his position clear: either give up the baby for adoption or leave his house forever. She had chosen her unborn child, a decision that now left her homeless as the first cold snap of the season descended upon the Montana territory. "You cannot stay in town," her father had declared to the congregation that morning, his voice thundering through the small church. "Let this be a lesson to all young women who stray from God's path." The scandal of being an unwed mother was bad enough, but Nora's steadfast refusal to name the father had turned the entire town against her. Only she knew the truth. The handsome traveling salesman who had promised marriage before disappearing with her virtue and her grandmother's silver locket the only item of value she had possessed. Night was falling quickly as Nora made her way toward the edge of town. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the whispers that followed her every step. The baby kicked inside her, a reminder of both her shame and her determination. "Miss? You all right there?" A deep voice called from the shadows. Nora startled, clutching her bag tighter as a tall figure emerged from beside the livery stable. She took a step back, wary of strangers after all she'd been through. The man stepped into the glow of a nearby lantern, revealing a weathered face beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. He wasn't from town. She would have recognized him, but his eyes held none of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "I'm Daniel Blackwood," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed to be in some trouble." Nora lifted her chin, determined not to appear as desperate as she felt. "I'm fine, sir. Just heading out of town." Daniel's gaze flickered to her rounded belly, then back to her face without a trace of condemnation. "It's getting mighty cold, and there's nothing but open country for 20 miles. You got somewhere to stay?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. Nora bit her lip, fighting back fresh tears. "I'll manage. My ranch is about 5 miles west," Daniel said, gesturing toward the setting sun. "I've got a spare room that's going unused. You'd be welcome to it until you figure things out." Nora regarded him suspiciously. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Daniel's expression softened. "My sister found herself in a similar situation some years back. Nobody helped her." He paused, a shadow crossing his features. "She didn't survive the winter. Neither did her baby." The raw pain in his voice rang true, and Nora felt her defenses waver. Still, she hesitated. "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera," Daniel added, sensing her concern. "She's there all the time. You'd be proper and safe. I give you my word as a gentleman." A particularly fierce gust of wind cut through Nora's thin coat, making her decision for her. She had little choice if she wanted her baby to survive. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "I would be grateful for shelter, just until I can make other arrangements." Daniel nodded, relief visible on his face. "My wagon's this way. Let me help with your bag." As they walked toward the livery, Nora felt the weight of the town's stares on her back. She knew the gossip would only intensify Minister Sullivan's fallen daughter, leaving with a strange cowboy. But for the first time in months, someone had looked at her with kindness instead of contempt. Daniel helped her into the wagon with gentle hands, making sure she was settled comfortably before climbing up himself. As the horses pulled away from Silver Creek, Nora watched the only home she'd ever known fade into the distance, uncertain of what awaited her but clinging to a fragile thread of hope. The journey to Daniel's ranch passed in relative silence. Nora was too exhausted to maintain conversation, and Daniel seemed content to focus on the darkening trail ahead. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or share a brief observation about the territory, his deep voice a reassuring presence in the gathering darkness. "Almost there," he said as they crested a small hill. "You can see the lights of the main house just ahead." Nora peered through the twilight to see warm lamplight glowing from the windows of a substantial log home nestled against a stand of pines. Beyond it, she could make out the silhouettes of a barn and several outbuildings modest but well maintained. As they approached, the front door of the house swung open, and a short, round woman with silver-streaked black hair hurried out onto the porch. "Daniel! Where have you been?" "Supper's been waiting." Mrs. Rivera stopped abruptly when she spotted Nora. Her eyebrows rose, but to Nora's surprise, the woman's expression quickly shifted from surprise to concern. "Who is this poor girl? She looks half frozen." "This is Miss Nora," Daniel said as he brought the wagon to a stop. "She needs a place to stay for a while." Mrs. Rivera took in Nora's condition with a quick glance, then nodded briskly. "Well, don't just sit there, Daniel. Help her inside. I'll put on some tea and warm up the stew." Daniel jumped down from the wagon and came around to offer Nora his hand. The simple courtesy, after months of being treated like a pariah, nearly undid her composure. "Thank you," she whispered, allowing him to support her weight as she climbed down. Mrs. Rivera was already bustling about when they entered the house, muttering in Spanish as she stoked the fire and moved a kettle onto the stove. The interior was simple but comfortable, solid wooden furniture, colorful woven rugs on the plank floors, and shelves lined with books. It smelled of pine, coffee, and something delicious simmering on the stove. Sit, Mrs. Rivera insisted, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "You look dead on your feet, child." Nora sank gratefully into the offered seat, her legs trembling with fatigue. Daniel set her carpet bag by the door and hung his hat on a peg. "I found Miss Nora in town," he explained to Mrs. Rivera. "She needs somewhere safe to stay for a while." The housekeeper nodded, her dark eyes softening as she glanced at Nora's belly. "How far along are you, dear?" "About 7 months, I think," Nora replied, her hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. Mrs. Rivera clicked her tongue. "Too thin. We'll need to feed you properly." She turned to Daniel. "She can have the blue room. It gets the morning sun." Daniel nodded. "I'll bring in some firewood to warm it up." As he stepped back outside, Mrs. Rivera placed a steaming mug of tea in front of Nora. "Drink this. It will help with the chill." Nora wrapped her cold fingers around the warm mug. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "I can work to earn my keep until the baby comes." Mrs. Rivera's expression softened. "There will be time enough for that when you've rested. For now, you need to think of the little one." She paused, studying Nora's face. "Does your family know where you are?" Nora looked down at her tea. "I don't have family anymore." Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. "Ah, I see." She patted Nora's shoulder gently. "Well, you're safe here. Daniel is a good man, the best I know. He would never turn away someone in need." The warmth of the kitchen, the kindness in Mrs. Rivera's voice, and the sheer relief of finding shelter overwhelmed Nora's defenses. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed by her display. No, child," Mrs. Rivera soothed, pressing a handkerchief into Nora's hand. "You cry if you need to. God knows you've earned it." When Daniel returned with an armload of firewood, he found Nora composed once more, sipping her tea while Mrs. Rivera ladled stew into bowls. "I've put fresh linens on the bed in the blue room," Mrs. Rivera informed him. "After supper, I'll show Miss Nora upstairs." Daniel set the wood by the hearth and washed his hands at the basin. "Thank you, Elena." He took a seat across from Nora, his expression kind but careful. "I hope you'll be comfortable here, Miss Nora. It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry." "It's more than I deserve," Nora said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Daniel replied, his eyes serious. Everyone deserves kindness. As they ate the hearty stew, Nora felt some of the tension leave her body. For the first time in months, she wasn't being judged or condemned. In this simple kitchen, with the fire crackling and the wind howling outside, she had found an unexpected sanctuary. Later, as Mrs. Rivera showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom with blue patterned curtains and a quilt-covered bed, Nora allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things might turn out all right after all. "Sleep well, child," Mrs. Rivera said, lighting the bedside lamp. "Tomorrow is a new day." As Nora sank into the first real bed she'd had in weeks, her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to her unborn child. "Just you and me." She fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the pines and, somewhere in the distance, the low, comforting voice of Daniel Blackwood singing softly to his horses in the barn. Morning came with pale golden light filtering through the blue curtains. For a moment, Nora lay disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above her a source of confusion until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was at the Blackwood Ranch, miles away from Silver Creek and the condemnation of her father and the townspeople. A gentle knock at the door preceded Mrs. Rivera's cheerful voice. "Breakfast in 15 minutes, Miss Nora. There's hot water in the pitcher for washing up." "Thank you," Nora called back, pushing herself up with some effort. The baby seemed particularly active this morning, tiny feet or elbows pressing against her ribs. She dressed quickly in one of her two remaining dresses of faded blue cotton that strained across her growing belly and made a futile attempt to tame her unruly auburn hair. The mirror above the washstand reflected a pale face with shadows under green eyes that had once sparkled with laughter. Nora barely recognized herself. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Rivera frying bacon while Daniel sat at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand and a ledger open before him. "Good morning, Miss Nora," he said, rising as she entered. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, taking the seat he pulled out for her. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "It's nothing," he replied, returning to his seat. In the morning light, Nora could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with dark brown hair and eyes the color of coffee. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with smile lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of a good nature. Mrs. Rivera placed a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of Nora. Eat," she insisted. "Growing a baby requires strength." The food was simple but delicious, and Nora realized how hungry she truly was. As she ate, Daniel explained a little about the ranch. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's good land," he said. "I run about 200 head of cattle and keep a small herd of horses. I do some breeding quarter horses mostly. Daniel's horses are the finest in 3 counties, Mrs. Rivera added proudly as she refilled their coffee cups. "People come from as far as Helena to buy his stock." A hint of color touched Daniel's cheeks at the praise. "We get by," he said modestly. "The ranch was my father's. He came out here from Pennsylvania right after the war. Built this place from nothing." "Are your parents still living?" Nora asked. A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "No. Lost them both to influenza 5 years ago. It's just me now." Nora recognized the familiar pain of loss in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "My mother died when I was 12. It was just my father and me after that." Daniel nodded in understanding. "It changes you, losing family." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sounds of breakfast and Mrs. Rivera's quiet humming as she worked. "I meant what I said last night," Nora said finally. "I want to earn my keep while I'm here. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." Daniel looked like he might protest, but Mrs. Rivera spoke first. "The mending would be a blessing." "My eyes aren't what they used to be," and Daniel tears through shirts like they're made of paper. "And I could use help with the bookkeeping," Daniel added, tapping the ledger. "If you've got any skill with numbers." Nora nodded eagerly. I was always good with figures. I helped my father with the church accounts. Then it's settled, Daniel said with a smile that transformed his serious face. You'll help where you can, but promise you'll rest when you need to. That little one comes first. Agreed, Nora said, relief washing through her. Having work would give her purpose and allow her to repay some small portion of their kindness. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself to tend to the horses, leaving Nora to help Mrs. Rivera with the dishes. He's a good man, the housekeeper said as they worked. Too long alone, if you asked me, but kind to his core. How long have you worked for him? Nora asked, carefully drying a plate. Since his parents were alive, Mrs. Rivera replied. My husband worked this ranch too, until a horse threw him 3 years ago. Daniel pays for my cottage just the same, even though I'm only one pair of hands now instead of two. Nora absorbed this information, adding it to her growing impression of Daniel Blackwood. He mentioned his sister last night. She died? Mrs. Rivera's hands stilled in the dishwater. Maria. Such a beautiful girl. She got in trouble with a man passing through much like yourself, I expect. Their father cast her out, though their mother begged him not to. Daniel was away, driving cattle to market. By the time he returned and went looking for her, the older woman crossed herself. They found her in an abandoned line shack up in the hills. The baby, too. That winter was particularly cruel. Nora's heart ached at the story. How terrible! It changed something in Daniel, Mrs. Rivera continued. He never forgave his father for what happened, though they made peace before the old man died. Since then, Daniel has had a soft spot for those in need. She fixed Nora with a kind but serious gaze. Which is why you must never think you're taking advantage of his kindness. By helping you, he honors his sister's memory. Nora nodded solemnly. I understand. And I'm truly grateful. When the dishes were done, Mrs. Rivera showed Nora around the house, a tour that didn't take long as the structure was solidly built but modest. 4 rooms downstairs, the kitchen with its large hearth, a dining room rarely used except for special occasions, Daniel's study filled with books and maps, and a comfortable sitting room. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a small room Mrs. Rivera used for sewing. Daniel's at the far end of the hall, she explained. I sleep in town most nights, in the cottage Daniel provides, though I stay here when the weather's bad. You don't live here full-time? Nora asked, surprised. I come each day at dawn and leave after supper, unless there's a reason to stay, Mrs. Rivera replied. My grandchildren are in town, and I help my daughter with them when I can. The thought of being alone in the house with Daniel made Nora nervous, but she reminded herself that he had been nothing but respectful. Still, her reputation, what little remained of it, would be completely ruined if anyone learned she was staying unchaperoned at a bachelor's ranch. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Rivera patted her arm. Don't worry, child. Daniel is a gentleman through and through, and anyone who might gossip would have to ride 5 miles out of their way to do it. The remainder of the day passed peacefully as Nora settled into her new surroundings. True to her word, she took on the mending, sitting in a comfortable chair by the sitting room window while she repaired shirts and socks. The simple, repetitive work was soothing, and for brief periods she could almost forget the circumstances that had brought her here. Daniel returned mid-afternoon, bringing with him the crisp scent of autumn air and horses. He smiled when he saw her working, but made no comment beyond asking if she was comfortable. Very much so, Nora assured him. Mrs. Rivera has been most kind. Elena has a good heart, Daniel replied, warming his hands by the fire. Been like family to me since I was a boy. She told me about your sister, Nora said softly. I'm sorry for your loss. Daniel's expression grew distant. Maria was the kindest soul I've ever known. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does, Nora said, thinking of her own predicament. Daniel's gaze fell to her swollen belly, then back to her face. No, they don't. An understanding passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared pain, and the injustice of a world that punished women for their mistakes while men often walked away unscathed. Daniel cleared his throat. I was thinking, if you're feeling up to it, I could show you around the ranch tomorrow. It's good to know where things are if you're going to be staying a while. The casual mention of an extended stay gave Nora pause. In the chaos of her departure from Silver Creek, she hadn't thought beyond finding immediate shelter. The reality of her situation, unmarried, pregnant, and with no family support, meant her options were severely limited. That would be nice, she said finally. Though I don't want to impose on your hospitality for too long. Daniel's expression softened. Miss Nora, you're welcome here for as long as you need. That includes after the baby comes. Tears pricked at Nora's eyes at his kindness. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Sometimes, Daniel said quietly, the right thing to do is also the simplest. You needed help. I can provide it. He paused, then added with a small smile. Besides, Mrs. Rivera is already attached to you, and I've learned never to cross that woman. His attempt at humor broke the tension, and Nora found herself smiling a genuine smile that felt foreign on her face after so many months of sorrow. Thank you, she said simply. Daniel nodded, then excused himself to return to his chores, leaving Nora to ponder the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this ranch and this remarkable man who offered help with no expectation of return. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal of roast chicken and vegetables, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: peace. It was fragile and tentative, overshadowed by the uncertainty of her future, but it was there nonetheless, a small flame of hope flickering in the darkness that had consumed her life. As October gave way to November, Nora settled into life at the Blackwood Ranch with surprising ease. The routine of country living suited her, providing structure to days that had previously been filled with anxiety and fear. Each morning, she rose with the sun to help Mrs. Rivera prepare breakfast before Daniel came in from his early chores. The afternoons were spent managing the ranch accounts, mending clothes, or assisting with household tasks as her condition allowed. Daniel proved to be a considerate host, always ensuring she had everything she needed while maintaining a respectful distance. He seemed to sense when she needed company and when she craved solitude, a perceptiveness that Nora found both comforting and slightly unnerving. No man had ever paid such careful attention to her comfort before, not even the charming salesman who had stolen her heart and abandoned her with child. True to his word, Daniel had shown her the ranch the day after her arrival, a tour necessarily limited by her condition but comprehensive nonetheless. The property stretched across several hundred acres of Montana wilderness, from rolling grasslands perfect for grazing to stands of pine and aspen that provided shelter for the wildlife that abounded in the region. My father chose this land because it has everything, Daniel had explained as they stood on a small rise overlooking the main pastures. Water from the creek year-round, good grass for the cattle, timber for building and firewood, and enough isolation to keep trouble at bay. The isolation was indeed profound. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, a Swedish family named Eriksson who ran a smaller cattle operation. Silver Creek, the closest town, was 5 miles to the east. This remoteness, which might have frightened Nora under different circumstances, now felt like a blessing. Here, far from judgmental eyes, she could await her baby's arrival in peace. As her time grew nearer, Nora found herself increasingly grateful for Mrs. Rivera's presence. The older woman had borne 6 children of her own and helped deliver countless others among the families in the area. Her practical knowledge and no-nonsense approach to childbirth were reassuring. Babies come when they're ready, not before, she told Nora one afternoon as they prepared vegetables for stew. All this worrying doesn't help anything. The little one knows its business. Nora smiled weakly, her hand resting on her belly where the baby tumbled and kicked with increasing vigor. I can't help but worry. I've never done this before. No woman has until she does, Mrs. Rivera replied pragmatically. But women have been having babies since Eve, and most of us manage just fine. Despite the housekeeper's reassurances, Nora's fears ran deeper than the physical aspects of childbirth. What kind of life could she provide for her child? How would she support them both? Where would they go once the baby was born and they could no longer impose on Daniel's kindness? These questions plagued her, especially in the quiet hours of the night when sleep eluded her. Sometimes she would rise from her bed and stand by the window, gazing out at the star-filled Montana sky, searching for answers that never came. It was during one such night, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival at the ranch, that Nora encountered Daniel outside of their usual mealtime interactions. Unable to find a comfortable position for sleep, she had wrapped herself in a shawl and made her way downstairs, thinking a cup of warm milk might help. She was surprised to find a lamp still burning in the sitting room and Daniel seated in an armchair, a book open on his lap. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Miss Nora," he said, setting his book aside and rising. "Is everything all right?" "Just having trouble sleeping," she admitted. "The baby is quite active tonight." Daniel nodded in understanding. "Would you like some tea?" "I was just about to make some myself." "That would be lovely, thank you." She followed him to the kitchen, where he stoked the banked fire in the stove and set a kettle to boil. Nora sank into a chair, watching as he moved with easy confidence around the space that was usually Mrs. Rivera's domain. "You're quite at home in the kitchen," she observed. Daniel smiled as he reached for the tea canister. "Had to learn to fend for myself over the years. Mrs. Rivera taught me the basics, though I'm nowhere near her skill level." "You're fortunate to have her," Nora said. "She's been very kind to me." "Elena has a big heart," Daniel agreed. "And she's taken quite a shine to you. Says you have good hands, high praise from her." Nora felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "She's been teaching me some of her recipes. I never learned much cooking from my mother. She died before she could teach me, and my father wasn't one for elaborate meals." The kettle began to whistle, and Daniel moved it off the heat. As he prepared the tea, a comfortable silence fell between them. "May I ask you something, Miss Nora?" Daniel said finally, setting a steaming cup in front of her. Nora tensed slightly, accustomed to intrusive questions about her situation. "Of course," she replied cautiously. Daniel took the seat across from her. "What did you dream of before?" He gestured vaguely toward her belly. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her dreams in a very long time, perhaps ever. Her father had been concerned with propriety and duty, not the secret wishes of a young woman's heart. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said after a moment, surprised by how easily the admission came. "I love books and learning. I thought perhaps I might teach at a small school somewhere." She smiled sadly. "It seems foolish now." "Not foolish at all," Daniel countered. "You've got a sharp mind. I've seen how quickly you picked up the ranch accounts, sorted out errors I'd been making for months." "Thank you," Nora said, warming under his praise. "But who would hire an unwed mother to teach their children? My reputation is... well, it's ruined." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Out here, people can reinvent themselves. The past doesn't have to define your future." "Perhaps," Nora allowed, though she remained unconvinced. "What about you? Did you always want to be a rancher?" A smile played at the corners of Daniel's mouth. "Not at all. As a boy, I was determined to be a Pony Express rider." Nora laughed softly. "Were you very disappointed when they stopped running?" "Devastated," Daniel confirmed with a chuckle. "Then I set my sights on being a Texas Ranger, until my father pointed out we were in Montana, not Texas." "Quite the dreamer," Nora observed, finding it easy to imagine a younger Daniel with wild ambitions. "I suppose I was," he agreed. "But the ranch got into my blood eventually. There's something about this land that holds you." His gaze grew distant, looking beyond the kitchen walls to the vast territory outside. "The freedom of it, I think. The sense that you're building something that will last." Nora saw then what she had missed before: the deep love Daniel had for his home and his way of life. It wasn't just a business to him, it was a calling. "It's a beautiful place," she said softly. You've built something remarkable here. Daniel's eyes returned to her, warm with appreciation. Thank you for seeing that. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, making Nora gasp and place her hand on her belly. Active little one, Daniel observed. Very, Nora agreed, wincing as another kick landed against her ribs. Mrs. Rivera says that's a good sign, means the baby is strong. Daniel hesitated, then asked, May I? He extended his hand slightly, then pulled it back. Forgive me, that's too forward. No, it's all right, Nora said, surprised by her own lack of hesitation. She took his hand and placed it on the side of her belly where the baby was most active. For a moment, nothing happened, and Nora feared the baby had settled. Then came a solid thump against Daniel's palm. His eyes widened in wonder. That's amazing, he breathed, his expression one of pure awe. The simple joy on his face touched something deep within Nora. Here was a man who saw her child not as a source of shame, but as a miracle, a new life to be celebrated. The baby kicked again, and Daniel laughed softly. Quite a fighter you've got there. Yes, Nora agreed, a sudden lump in her throat. Like its mother will have to be. Daniel's hand lingered a moment longer before he withdrew it, his expression growing serious once more. You won't have to fight alone, Miss Nora. Not while you're here. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Nora found herself believing him despite all the lessons life had taught her about trusting others, especially men. Thank you, she whispered. They finished their tea in comfortable silence, the connection between them subtly altered by the moment they had shared. When Nora finally returned to her room, the baby had settled, and sleep came more easily than it had in weeks. As she drifted off, she realized that for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she wasn't afraid of the future. Whatever came, she would face it with newfound strength and perhaps, if she was very fortunate, with friends by her side. The first snowfall of the season came in late November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Nora stood at the window of her bedroom, watching as the flakes drifted down from a steel-gray sky. The landscape had been transformed overnight, familiar contours now soft and rounded beneath the snow. It's beautiful, she murmured to herself, one hand absently rubbing her lower back where an ache had been building since dawn. A knock at her door pulled her attention from the winter scene. Come in, she called. Mrs. Rivera entered, carrying a stack of freshly laundered linens. Good morning, child. How are you feeling today? A bit uncomfortable, Nora admitted. My back has been bothering me since I woke. The housekeeper set down the linens and studied Nora with shrewd eyes. How long have you been having pains? Just since morning, Nora replied, then caught the significant look on Mrs. Rivera's face. You don't think? The baby is due any day now, Mrs. Rivera reminded her. Backache is often how it starts. Nora felt a flutter of panic. But it's too early. The snow. Babies don't consult the weather before deciding to arrive, Mrs. Rivera said pragmatically. Come, sit down and let me feel your belly. Nora complied, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. Mrs. Rivera's experienced hands pressed gently but firmly, feeling the position of the baby. Head down, good, she murmured. And the pains, do they come and go, or are they constant? They come and go, Nora said, realization dawning. I thought it was just from sleeping poorly. Mrs. Rivera nodded. How far apart? Nora tried to recall. I'm not sure. Perhaps 20 minutes? They're not very strong. Early yet then, the older woman concluded. But I think today might be the day your little one decides to join us. A mixture of excitement and terror washed over Nora. Despite months of preparation, she suddenly felt wholly unprepared for the reality of childbirth. What should I do? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Mrs. Rivera's expression softened. For now we wait. Walk a little if you feel up to it. Movement can help things progress. I'll prepare the room and let Daniel know. Daniel? Nora repeated, alarmed at the thought of him knowing such intimate details. He'll need to fetch the doctor from town if there's time, Mrs. Rivera explained. Though with this snow, and first babies often taking their time, we may manage on our own. The thought of giving birth without a doctor added to Nora's anxiety, but Mrs. Rivera's calm confidence was reassuring. I've delivered many babies, the housekeeper reminded her, including all of my grandchildren. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Nora nodded, trying to draw strength from the other woman's matter-of-fact approach. I trust you. Good, Mrs. Rivera said, patting her hand. Now, let's get you dressed in something comfortable. It may be a long day. By mid-afternoon, there was no longer any doubt that Nora's labor had begun in earnest. The pains were coming regularly now, about 15 minutes apart, strong enough that she had to stop and breathe through them. Daniel had indeed gone for the doctor, setting out on horseback as soon as Mrs. Rivera informed him of the situation. The snowfall had lightened, but the accumulated inches would make travel slow. He'll be back as soon as he can, Mrs. Rivera assured Nora as they walked slowly around the sitting room. But babies come in their own time. Yours may not wait for the doctor. Nora nodded, pausing as another contraction built. She gripped the back of a chair, breathing deeply until the pain subsided. You're doing well, Mrs. Rivera said approvingly. Some women fight the pain, but you're working with it. I don't seem to have much choice, Nora replied with a weak smile. The afternoon wore on, the labor intensifying as daylight began to fade. Mrs. Rivera had prepared the blue bedroom, covering the mattress with oilcloth and laying out clean linens, towels, and a basin of water. A fire blazed in the small hearth, keeping the room comfortably warm. As darkness fell, the contractions grew stronger and closer together. Nora found herself unable to walk through them anymore, instead gripping the bedpost and swaying as waves of pain washed over her. 8 minutes apart now, Mrs. Rivera announced after timing the last one. Progress is good. How are you feeling? Scared, Nora admitted, sinking onto the edge of the bed during a respite between pains. What if something goes wrong? Nothing will go wrong, Mrs. Rivera said firmly. You're young and healthy, the baby is in a good position, and I'm here. Trust the process, Nora. It was the first time the older woman had used her name without the Miss, and somehow the familiarity was comforting. I'm trying, Nora whispered. The sound of the front door opening and closing echoed up the stairs, followed by the heavy tread of boots. Daniel's back, Mrs. Rivera said, moving to the hallway. I'll see if the doctor is with him. She returned moments later, her expression apologetic. The doctor is delivering another baby in town. Daniel says he'll come as soon as he's finished, but it could be hours. Nora closed her eyes briefly, fighting a wave of panic. So it's just us. Just us, Mrs. Rivera confirmed. But that's all we need. She squeezed Nora's hand. Daniel is heating water and will bring it up. He wants to know if there's anything else you need. The thought of Daniel's concern touched Nora deeply. No, just thank him for trying. Another contraction built, stronger than the ones before. Nora gasped, curling forward as the pain peaked and held longer than previous ones. Good, Mrs. Rivera encouraged. Let it work. Your body knows what to do. When the contraction finally eased, Nora looked up to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and helplessness. He held a steaming kettle in one hand. I brought the hot water, he said, his voice rough with worry. Elena, what else can I do? Put it on the hearth, Mrs. Rivera directed. Then perhaps you could make some tea? This may be a long night. Daniel nodded, his eyes meeting Nora's briefly. You're doing great, he said awkwardly, clearly out of his depth but determined to offer support. Thank you for trying to get the doctor, Nora managed before another contraction began to build. Daniel backed out of the room as Mrs. Rivera moved to support Nora through the pain. As the hours passed, the labor intensified relentlessly. Nora lost track of time, existing only in the rhythm of contraction and release, pain and respite. Mrs. Rivera remained a constant presence, offering water, cool cloths for her forehead, and unwavering encouragement. "You're entering the hardest part now," the older woman explained as the contractions came only minutes apart. "Soon you'll feel the urge to push." Nora, exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, could only nod. She had long since shed any modesty or reserve, focused entirely on the primal task of bringing her child into the world. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow against the windows in icy gusts. The storm that had threatened all day had arrived in full force, making it unlikely the doctor would make it to the ranch before morning. Midnight came and went. In the hallway, Daniel paced, pausing whenever Nora's cries intensified. He had been banished from the room hours ago but refused to retire to his own quarters, determined to be of use if needed. "Daniel!" Mrs. Rivera called finally, appearing in the doorway with a basin of soiled water. "Bring fresh hot water and more towels. It's almost time." He hurried to comply, returning minutes later with the requested items. Mrs. Rivera took them at the door, but before she could close it, Nora called out from within. "Daniel!" Her voice was strained but determined. "Thank you for everything. You're going to be fine," he promised, wishing he could offer more than just words. "Both of you." Mrs. Rivera gently closed the door, and Daniel resumed his vigil in the hallway. The sounds from within the room grew more intense: Nora's labored breathing, Mrs. Rivera's steady instructions, and finally, the unmistakable effort of pushing. Time stretched impossibly as Daniel sat on the floor outside the blue bedroom, head bowed, offering silent prayers for the safety of mother and child. He thought of his sister, alone and afraid during her own labor, and felt a fierce protectiveness toward Nora that surprised him with its intensity. Then, cutting through the howl of the winter storm, came a new sound: the thin, indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Daniel's head jerked up, his heart pounding as the cry strengthened. He rose to his feet just as Mrs. Rivera opened the door, her face weary but triumphant. "A girl," she announced. "Healthy and perfect. Come see." Daniel hesitated. "Is Nora?" "Tired but well," Mrs. Rivera assured him. "She asked for you?" He followed the housekeeper into the room, where Nora reclined against a mound of pillows, her hair damp with perspiration but her face radiant despite her exhaustion. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny bundle. "Daniel," she said softly, "meet my daughter." He approached cautiously, overwhelmed by the tableau before him. Nora shifted the blanket to reveal a small, perfect face with a dusting of auburn hair and eyes squeezed tightly shut. "She's beautiful," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." Nora's eyes filled with tears at the simple compliment. "I want to name her Elizabeth, after my mother. Elizabeth Maria Sullivan." The inclusion of his sister's name struck Daniel deeply. "Maria would be honored," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have survived this without you both," Nora said, looking from Daniel to Mrs. Rivera. "I can never repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Daniel assured her. "Having you both safe is all that matters." As he gazed down at mother and child, something shifted in Daniel's heart, a protective tenderness that transcended mere charity or kindness. In that moment, as the winter storm raged outside and new life bloomed within, he recognized a simple truth: this woman and her child had become important to him in ways he had never anticipated. The realization should have frightened him, but instead, it filled him with a sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "Rest now," he said gently. "You've both had quite a journey." As he turned to leave, Nora caught his hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Just for a little while." So he sat beside her bed as dawn approached, watching over the two souls who had unexpectedly changed his life, while outside, the storm gradually yielded to the quiet peace of a snow-covered Montana morning. The weeks following Elizabeth's birth passed in a blur of midnight feedings, diaper changes, and the countless small adjustments that came with a newborn in the house. Daniel had insisted that Nora stay at the ranch to recover, an offer she gratefully accepted, having nowhere else to go, and no means to support herself and her daughter. December brought deeper snows and the quiet isolation of winter in the Montana Territory. The ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by necessary chores and the needs of a newborn. Mrs. Rivera came daily, teaching Nora the intricacies of motherhood with patience and good humor. "You're a natural," she told Nora one afternoon as she successfully soothed the fussy Elizabeth. "Some women take months to learn what you've picked up in weeks." Nora smiled down at her daughter, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around her own. "She makes it easy. She's such a good baby. Takes after her mother," Mrs. Rivera observed. "Strong but gentle." As Christmas approached, Daniel busied himself with ranch work, often returning late in the evenings covered in snow and smelling of pine. He was building something in the barn but refused to say what, brushing off Nora's curious questions with a smile and a promise that she'd see soon enough. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Rivera arrived with her daughter's family, 2 sons and a daughter ranging in age from 5 to 12, to prepare a festive dinner. The house filled with the scents of roasting meat, cinnamon, and pine from the small tree Daniel had cut and placed in the sitting room. "It's not much," he apologized as Nora admired the simple decorations: paper stars, dried berries, and a few precious glass ornaments that had belonged to his mother. "It's perfect," she assured him, cradling Elizabeth against her shoulder. "More than I expected to have this Christmas." The memory of her father's rejection still stung, but the pain had dulled somewhat in the warmth of her new surroundings. Here, holding her daughter among people who had shown her nothing but kindness, Nora felt a contentment she hadn't thought possible a few months ago. After a hearty dinner, Mrs. Rivera's grandchildren sang carols while Daniel played a battered harmonica with surprising skill. Little Elizabeth, swaddled in a soft blanket Mrs. Rivera had knitted, slept peacefully in a cradle Daniel had fashioned from a drawer, seemingly lulled by the music and laughter. When the children had exhausted their repertoire of songs, Daniel excused himself briefly, returning with several packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "I'm not much for wrapping," he said apologetically as he distributed the gifts. For Mrs. Rivera's grandchildren, there were wooden toys. He had carved himself a horse, a doll, and a miniature wagon that actually rolled. "And this," he said, handing a small package to Nora, "is for you." Surprised, Nora carefully unwrapped the gift to find a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered blank pages and a pencil tucked into the spine. "A journal," Daniel explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought you might like to write down your thoughts, or maybe stories for Elizabeth when she's older. You mentioned once that you loved books and writing." Touched that he had remembered such a casual comment, Nora ran her fingers over the soft leather. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." "There's one more thing," Daniel said, reaching into his pocket. "This is for Elizabeth." He placed a small object in Nora's palm, a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Daniel," Nora breathed, recognizing the piece instantly. "This was your sister's, wasn't it?" He nodded, his expression solemn. "Maria would have wanted her namesake to have it. For when she's older, of course." Tears welled in Nora's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," Daniel replied softly, so only she could hear. "At least through the winter. The roads will be bad until spring anyway." Nora looked up at him, searching his face. "Are you sure? We've already imposed so much." "It's not an imposition," he assured her. "Having you both here has made this place feel like a home again." The simple honesty in his voice dispelled any doubts. "Then we'll stay," she agreed. "Until spring." Daniel's smile was worth more than any Christmas gift. Later, after Mrs. Rivera and her family had departed and Elizabeth had been fed and settled for what would hopefully be a few hours of sleep, Nora found Daniel sitting alone by the fire in the sitting room, staring into the flames. "May I join you?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, his expression warming at the sight of her. Of course. Nora took the chair opposite his, the journal he had given her clutched in her hands. I wanted to thank you again for everything. This has been the most wonderful Christmas I can remember. I'm glad, Daniel said sincerely. You and Elizabeth deserve some happiness. As do you, Nora replied. You've given us so much, but what do you want, Daniel? For yourself, I mean. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, considering. I suppose I want what most men want, he said finally. A good life. A family. Something to build and protect. He poked at the fire with an iron, sending sparks up the chimney. For a long time after Maria died, I was just existing. Keeping the ranch going because it was what my father would have wanted, but not really living. Nora nodded in understanding. And now? A small smile touched his lips. Now I find myself thinking about the future again. Making plans. Wanting things. What kind of things? Nora asked, her heart beating a little faster at the intensity in his gaze. Things I probably shouldn't speak of, Daniel admitted. Not yet, anyway. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Nora felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, hope, mixed with a tenderness that both thrilled and frightened her. I should probably check on Elizabeth, she said after a moment, needing some distance to process the emotions welling up inside her. Daniel nodded, understanding her retreat. Of course. Good night, Nora. Good night, Daniel, she replied softly, rising from her chair. Merry Christmas. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Nora reflected on how much had changed in the few months since she'd arrived at the Blackwood ranch. She had come as a desperate, frightened young woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. Now she was a mother, with a roof over her head and people who cared for her. And Daniel. Daniel was becoming something she had never expected to find again after her bitter experience with Elizabeth's father, a man she could trust, perhaps even care for. The thought both comforted and terrified her. She had been so thoroughly deceived before, her heart broken and her reputation destroyed by a man's empty promises. Could she risk trusting again? As if sensing her mother's troubled thoughts, Elizabeth stirred in her cradle, making small mewling sounds that would soon become full-fledged cries if not attended to. Nora lifted her daughter, cradling her close and breathing in the sweet scent of her downy head. What do you think, little one? She whispered. Should we open our hearts again? Is it worth the risk? Elizabeth's only response was to nuzzle closer, seeking the warmth and security of her mother's embrace. In that simple, instinctive action, Nora found her answer. Life was about taking risks for love, for family, for the chance at happiness. She had risked everything to bring Elizabeth into the world. Perhaps it was time to risk her heart as well. Winter settled fully over the Montana territory, bringing with it days of bitter cold interspersed with heavy snowfalls that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. January passed slowly, the short days filled with necessary chores and the care of animals and infant alike. Daniel spent much of his time outside, ensuring the cattle had access to feed and water, breaking ice on the creek, and maintaining the buildings against the relentless assault of winter storms. He returned each evening exhausted but satisfied, his presence at the dinner table a highlight of Nora's day. Their conversations had grown deeper as the weeks passed, extending beyond the practicalities of ranch life to include their pasts, their beliefs, their hopes for the future. Daniel spoke of his childhood on the ranch, of his parents' love for each other and their children, of the devastating loss of his sister and his subsequent estrangement from his father. Nora, in turn, shared stories of her mother's gentle influence, her father's strict religious beliefs, and her own dreams of education and independence that had been set aside when she found herself with child. She spoke of her time with Elizabeth's father, only once a painful recounting that left her feeling vulnerable yet oddly lighter for having shared the burden. He was so charming, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. Thomas Walker, he called himself, though I later learned even his name was a lie. He came to Silver Creek selling household goods and patent medicines. Everyone was taken with him, even my father. Daniel listened quietly, his expression somber, as Nora described how the handsome salesman had courted her with pretty words and promises of marriage, convincing her to give him her most precious possession, her virtue, before disappearing one night with her grandmother's silver locket and several $100s he had collected from townspeople for orders he never intended to fulfill. By the time I realized I was with child, he was long gone, Nora concluded. My father. He wanted me to give up the baby, to claim illness and go stay with a distant cousin until after the birth. When I refused, he said I had chosen my sin over my family and God. Her voice caught on the painful memory. He gave me one night to reconsider. The next morning, he announced my shame to the entire congregation and told me not to return home. I'm sorry, Daniel said, his voice rough with anger on her behalf. No father should treat his child that way. Nora shrugged, though the wound was still raw. He believes he was doing right by God. Perhaps someday he'll forgive me. There's nothing to forgive, Daniel said firmly. You protected your child. That's what matters. His unwavering support touched Nora deeply. Thank you for saying that. It's the truth, Daniel replied simply. He hesitated, then asked, Do you ever worry that Thomas might return? The question had haunted Nora's dreams many times. Sometimes, she admitted. Not because I want him back, but because I fear what rights he might claim over Elizabeth. He abandoned you both, Daniel said, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. He has no rights. The law might see it differently, Nora pointed out. Though I doubt he'd want the responsibility. Men like Thomas don't change their nature. No, Daniel agreed. They don't. He stared into the fire for a long moment before adding, If he ever did return, you wouldn't face him alone. I want you to know that. The quiet conviction in his voice wrapped around Nora like a protective embrace. I know, she said softly. And that means more than I can say. As January gave way to February, subtle changes began to occur in the household. Daniel found more reasons to be inside during the day, offering to hold Elizabeth while Nora rested or prepared meals. He began reading aloud in the evenings newspaper articles, passages from books, even poetry that made Nora's heart beat faster with its romantic sentiments. For her part, Nora found herself taking extra care with her appearance, grateful for the dresses Mrs. Rivera had altered from Daniel's mother's clothes. Her figure was slowly returning to its pre-pregnancy state, though nursing Elizabeth had left her with a fuller bosom that sometimes drew Daniel's gaze before he quickly looked away, a flush coloring his cheeks. These small changes did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Rivera, who observed the growing attraction between them with knowing eyes but kept her thoughts to herself, save for an occasional knowing smile when she caught them standing closer than necessary or finding excuses to touch a hand brushing while passing a dish, fingers meeting over Elizabeth's cradle. February brought Valentine's Day, a holiday Nora had not expected to acknowledge in her circumstances. She was surprised when Daniel presented her with a small bouquet of dried wildflowers he had preserved from the previous summer, tied with a ribbon Mrs. Rivera had contributed. It's not much, he apologized. Fresh flowers are impossible this time of year. They're beautiful, Nora assured him, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Thank you. That evening, after putting Elizabeth down for the night, Nora joined Daniel for their customary fireside conversation. Something felt different tonight, a tension in the air, an expectancy that made her heart flutter with nervous anticipation. Daniel seemed unusually restless, standing to poke at the fire more often than necessary, starting sentences only to abandon them mid-thought. Finally, he took a deep breath and turned to face her, his expression serious. Nora, he began. I've been wanting to talk to you about something important. She set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. What is it? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. When you first came here, I offered you shelter because you needed help. It was the right thing to do. And I'm still grateful," Nora said, uncertain where this was leading. "The thing is," Daniel continued, "my feelings have changed since then." He met her gaze directly. "I care for you, Nora. And for Elizabeth. As more than just guests in my home." Nora's breath caught in her throat. Though she had sensed the shift in their relationship, hearing him speak the words aloud made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please let me finish," he said quickly. "I know you've been hurt before. I know you have every reason to be cautious. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know how I feel." The earnestness in his expression, the vulnerability in his eyes, touched something deep within Nora's heart. This was nothing like Thomas's practiced charm and easy lies. This was honest, and real, and therefore infinitely more frightening. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice steadier than she expected. "More than I thought possible after everything. But I'm afraid, Daniel. Not just for myself, but for Elizabeth. If I make another mistake, I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now," Daniel assured her. "I just want you to know that when you talked about leaving in the spring, well, I hope you'll consider staying permanently." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. This was more than a declaration of feelings. It was the beginning of a proposal of future together. "I need time," Nora said finally. "To be sure. For both our sakes." Daniel nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The simple promise, spoken without flourish or exaggeration, carried more weight than all of Thomas's elaborate vows combined. "Thank you," Nora said softly, "for understanding. And for being the man you are." Daniel smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you for being honest. It's one of the things I admire most about you." The conversation shifted then to lighter topics, but something had changed between them. A door had been opened, a possibility acknowledged. As Nora climbed the stairs to her room later that night, she felt both terrified and exhilarated by the future stretching before her, a future that might include not just survival, but love. February yielded to March, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to recede from the south-facing slopes, exposing patches of brown grass that promised eventual green. The days grew longer, the sunlight stronger, and a restless energy pervaded the ranch as winter's grip slowly loosened. Nora and Daniel continued their careful dance of growing affection, either pushing for more than the other was ready to give. He brought her wildflowers as they emerged, she baked his favorite cornbread, and they shared long conversations by the fire after Elizabeth was asleep, gradually building a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Elizabeth, now 3 months old, was thriving under the loving attention of her mother, Daniel, and Mrs. Rivera. She had begun to smile responsively, her green eyes so like Nora's lighting up with recognition when familiar faces appeared above her cradle. Daniel was particularly enchanted by these smiles, often going to great lengths to elicit them. "She's going to be as beautiful as her mother," he declared one afternoon as he held Elizabeth while Nora prepared dinner. "And just as smart, I'd wager." Nora smiled at the pride in his voice, the same pride a father might express. The thought gave her pause. In the months since Elizabeth's birth, Daniel had stepped into a paternal role with such natural ease that it was sometimes easy to forget he had no biological connection to her daughter. Yet he treated Elizabeth as if she were his own, spending hours rocking her, singing old cowboy songs in his surprisingly melodious baritone, and fashioning toys from bits of wood and leather. He spoke to her as if she understood every word, telling her about the ranch and the animals, promising to teach her to ride when she was old enough. It was this, more than anything, that had begun to heal the wounds in Nora's heart. Daniel's love for Elizabeth, unconditional and without obligation, showed the true measure of the man. As the snow melted and the roads became passable again, visitors to the ranch increased. Neighbors stopped by with the excuse of borrowing tools or returning items, though Nora suspected their real purpose was curiosity about the unmarried mother staying with bachelor Blackwood, as she'd heard Daniel was known in the area. To her surprise, most treated her with courtesy if not warmth. The Swedish family, the Eriksons, were particularly kind, bringing hand-me-down baby clothes and inviting her to attend church services with them when the weather permitted. "People will talk," Nora warned Daniel after accepting such an invitation. "About me staying here, about us." Daniel shrugged, unconcerned. "Let them talk. We know the truth of things." "And what is the truth?" Nora asked, needing to hear him articulate what had been developing between them. Daniel considered his words carefully before responding. "The truth is that I've grown to care deeply for both you and Elizabeth. That I hope, in time, you might consider making your home here permanently. That I would be honored to help raise Elizabeth as my own." He paused, then added quietly, "That I believe I'm falling in love with you, Nora Sullivan." The simple declaration, spoken without dramatic gesture or flowery language, struck Nora with its sincerity. This was not Thomas's practiced seduction but the honest confession of a man who valued truth above all else. "I think," Nora said slowly, her heart pounding, "that I might be falling in love with you too." The smile that lit Daniel's face was like sunrise breaking over the Montana hills, radiant and full of promise. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "Then we have time," he said. "To be sure." But time, as it happened, was not on their side. The very next day brought an unexpected visitor to the Blackwood ranch, one that would test the fragile bonds forming between Nora and Daniel. Nora was hanging laundry in the yard, enjoying the fresh spring air while Elizabeth napped inside under Mrs. Rivera's watchful eye, when the sound of an approaching horse drew her attention. A rider was coming up the drive, a well-dressed man on a fine bay gelding. Something about his posture, the confident set of his shoulders, sent a chill of recognition through Nora even before he drew close enough for her to see his face. When he did, the basket of laundry slipped from her nerveless fingers, clean clothes tumbling onto the muddy ground. "Hello, Nora," said Thomas Walker, looking just as handsome and self-assured as the day he'd ridden out of Silver Creek with her heart and her grandmother's locket. "It's been a while." Nora's throat constricted, making speech impossible. She stared at the man who had ruined her life and abandoned her to face the consequences alone, unable to process his sudden appearance. Thomas dismounted with practiced grace, tying his horse to the hitching post before approaching her. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, gold cufflinks glinting at his wrists. Success, it seemed, had continued to follow him even after leaving a trail of broken promises behind. "You're looking well," he said, his gaze traveling over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "Motherhood seems to agree with you." The mention of Elizabeth broke through Nora's paralysis. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas smiled, the charming expression she had once found irresistible now striking her as calculating. "I was passing through Silver Creek on business. Imagine my surprise when I heard about Minister Sullivan's daughter and her illegitimate child." He stepped closer. "Your father was quite forthcoming when I expressed concern for your welfare. Told me where to find you." Nora's mind raced. Why would her father tell Thomas where she was? Unless... "You told him you were my husband," she guessed, the pieces falling into place. "That you'd been away on business and only just learned about the baby." Thomas's smile widened. "I may have implied something to that effect. The old man was so relieved to think his daughter wasn't completely ruined, he practically gave me his blessing to bring you home." "Home?" Nora repeated incredulously. "I have no home with you, Thomas. You made that clear when you disappeared without a word." "An unfortunate misunderstanding," Thomas said smoothly. "I had urgent business in Chicago, family matters I couldn't delay. I always intended to return for you." "After 10 months?" Nora scoffed, anger replacing her initial shock. "You expect me to believe that? I admit my timing was regrettable." Thomas conceded. But I'm here now, ready to do right by you and the child. He reached into his pocket and produced a familiar silver object. I even brought this back. Consider it a peace offering. Nora stared at her grandmother's locket dangling from his fingers. Once, its return would have meant everything to her. Now, it seemed a paltry token compared to all he had taken from her. Keep it, she said coldly. I want nothing from you. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. Don't be hasty, Nora. Think of the child. She deserves her father's name, doesn't she? A respectable life? Her name is Elizabeth, Nora said firmly. Elizabeth Maria Sullivan. And she has everything she needs right here. With a bachelor rancher? Thomas's lip curled slightly. I've heard the rumors in town, Nora. Living here, unmarried, you're only trading one scandal for another. That's none of your concern, Nora replied, though his words struck a tender spot. The gossip had indeed followed her, even here. It is my concern, Thomas insisted. She's my daughter too. I have rights. The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. Before Nora could respond, the sound of boots on the porch steps drew both their attention. Daniel emerged from the house, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. He moved to stand beside Nora, his presence solid and reassuring. Everything all right out here? He asked, his voice deceptively calm though Nora could sense the tension beneath. Fine, she said quickly. This is an old acquaintance from Silver Creek. Thomas Walker. Recognition flashed in Daniel's eyes. Nora had told him enough about Elizabeth's father for him to understand the significance of this visit. Mr. Walker, Daniel said, his tone neutral but his stance protective. What brings you to my ranch? Thomas straightened, clearly assessing this new obstacle. I've come to see Nora and my child. Family matters, you understand? Nora hasn't mentioned expecting any family, Daniel replied evenly. Some situations are complicated, Thomas said with a tight smile. I'm sure you understand, Mr. Blackwood. Daniel Blackwood, Daniel supplied. And I understand perfectly. You're the man who abandoned Nora when she needed you most, then shows up months later expecting a welcome. Thomas's affable mask slipped slightly. My relationship with Nora is between us. I appreciate your hospitality toward her in my absence, but the matter is now resolved. I've come to take her and the child home. Home? Daniel repeated, his voice hardening. Nora has a home here, for as long as she wants it. As for Elizabeth, she's sleeping right now, and I won't have her disturbed. The two men faced each other, the tension palpable. Nora, caught between them, felt a surge of gratitude for Daniel's steady presence even as she feared what Thomas might do. He was not a man accustomed to being denied what he wanted. Perhaps we should discuss this inside, she suggested, not wanting the confrontation to escalate where Elizabeth might be disturbed. Daniel nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on Thomas. Mrs. Rivera has coffee on, if you'd care to join us, Mr. Walker. Thomas hesitated, clearly weighing his options before nodding curtly. Lead the way. Inside, Mrs. Rivera took one look at the tense group and whisked herself upstairs to sit with Elizabeth, leaving the three adults in the kitchen. Daniel poured coffee, his movements deliberate and controlled, while Thomas took a seat at the table as if he belonged there. Nora remained standing, too agitated to sit. I'll be direct, Thomas said once they were settled. I've come to make an honest woman of Nora and give my daughter my name. I have a successful business in Chicago now, a permanent address, prospects. I can provide for them both. Your offer comes rather late, Daniel observed coolly. Where were these concerns when Nora was cast out by her father? When she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to? Thomas's jaw tightened. As I explained to Nora, I had unavoidable business to attend to. Family matters. Convenient, Daniel remarked. Especially since you've never bothered to check if your child was even born healthy. Or if Nora survived the birth. I'm addressing that oversight now, Thomas countered. Better late than never, wouldn't you agree? Not necessarily, Daniel replied. Sometimes never is exactly what's needed. Thomas's practiced charm was wearing thin under Daniel's pointed observations. He turned his attention to Nora, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease. Nora, he said, his voice softening in a way she once found irresistible. I know I hurt you. I'm trying to make amends. Think of Elizabeth, don't you want her to grow up knowing her father? Having his name and protection? The appeal struck at Nora's deepest insecurities. Despite everything, there was a part of her that had always worried about raising Elizabeth alone, about the stigma her daughter would face as an illegitimate child. Elizabeth has everything she needs, Daniel said before Nora could respond. Including people who love her unconditionally. Where is your proof that you can offer the same? Thomas's expression hardened. She's my blood. My daughter. The law recognizes a father's rights. The law also recognizes abandonment, Daniel countered. And a mother's primary claim to her child. Are you a lawyer now, Blackwood? Thomas sneered. No, Daniel replied calmly. Just a man who believes in protecting those he cares about. The implication was clear, and Thomas's eyes narrowed as he glanced between Daniel and Nora. I see, he said slowly. You've found yourself a protector, Nora. How convenient for you both. That's enough, Nora said, finding her voice at last. Daniel has been nothing but kind and respectful, two qualities you know nothing about, Thomas. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I didn't come here to be insulted. I came to claim what's mine, my child and the woman who carries my blood. I am not yours, Nora said firmly. I never was. You made sure of that when you left without a word, taking what little I had of value. You'll regret this, Thomas warned, his handsome face ugly with anger. When I return with the law on my side, you'll wish you'd been more reasonable. Daniel rose as well, his height advantage more apparent as he faced the other man. I think you should leave now, Walker. Before you say something you can't take back. For a tense moment, it seemed Thomas might refuse. Then, with a final glare at Nora, he stormed out of the kitchen. They heard the front door slam, followed by the sound of hoofbeats, as he galloped away from the ranch. In the sudden silence, Nora's legs gave way, and she sank into a chair, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. He'll be back, she whispered, looking up at Daniel with fear in her eyes. He meant what he said about the law. What if he tries to take Elizabeth? Daniel knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. He won't take her, he promised. I won't let that happen. How can you stop him? Nora asked, desperation edging her voice. If he has legal rights, we'll fight him, Daniel said firmly. Together. And there's another way to ensure he can't separate you from Elizabeth. He hesitated, then continued. If you were married, your husband would have a stronger claim as Elizabeth's father than a man who abandoned you both. Nora's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. Daniel, are you? I'm asking you to marry me, Nora, he said simply. Not just to protect you from Walker, though I'd do anything to keep you both safe. But because I love you. Because I already love Elizabeth, as if she were my own. Because I want us to be a family officially, in the eyes of God and the law. The earnestness in his expression, the steady pressure of his hands holding hers, grounded Nora as her mind whirled with implications. Marriage to Daniel would solve so many problems. It would give Elizabeth a father, protect them both from Thomas's claims, provide security and respectability. But was that enough reason to say yes? Could she marry a man, even one as good as Daniel, for protection rather than love? I need to know, she said softly, that you're asking because you truly want this. Not out of obligation or fear of what Thomas might do. Nora Sullivan, Daniel said, his voice low and intense. I have been falling in love with you since the day you stood in my kitchen holding your newborn daughter, looking exhausted and terrified and more beautiful than any woman I've ever known. I love your strength, your kindness, your fierce devotion to Elizabeth. I love the way you hum when you're hanging laundry and the little crease between your eyebrows when you're balancing the accounts. He reached up to touch her cheek gently. I was planning to ask you properly in the spring, with flowers and perhaps a ring that belonged to my mother. Walker's arrival has forced my hand, but the question was always coming. I want to marry you because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Tears filled Nora's eyes at the simple, heartfelt declaration. This was nothing like Thomas's practiced charm and empty promises. This was real, honest, and imperfect, and infinitely more precious. Yes, she whispered, her heart finally certain. Yes, I'll marry you, Daniel Blackwood. The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He stood, pulling her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. We'll be married as soon as possible, he said against her hair. I'll ride into town tomorrow to speak with the pastor and make arrangements. Nora nodded against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since Thomas's appearance, she felt the fear begin to recede. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Upstairs, Elizabeth began to cry, her timing impeccable as always. Nora pulled back from Daniel's embrace with a watery laugh. Duty calls, she said, wiping at her tears. Daniel caught her hand before she could turn away. Our daughter has excellent timing, he said, his emphasis on the word our sending a wave of warmth through Nora. Our daughter, she repeated, testing the phrase and finding it felt right. Yes, she does. As she climbed the stairs to tend to Elizabeth, Nora's mind was already racing ahead. There was so much to do, so many decisions to make. But beneath the practical concerns lay a deep current of joy, unexpected, unlooked for, yet undeniably real. She had come to the Blackwood ranch seeking only shelter from a storm. Instead, she had found a home, a family, and a love she had thought forever beyond her reach. The wedding took place just 2 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by Mrs. Rivera and her family, the Ericksons, and a few of Daniel's closest neighbors. Nora wore a dove-gray dress that Mrs. Rivera had altered from one of Daniel's mother's gowns, with spring wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Daniel stood tall and proud at the altar, dressed in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Nora's face as she walked down the aisle with Elizabeth in her arms. The baby, now nearly 4 months old, was dressed in a christening gown Mrs. Erickson had lent them, her auburn curls wispy around her perfect face. She looks just like you, Daniel whispered as Nora reached his side, his gaze tender as it moved from mother to daughter. She has your smile, Nora replied softly, though of course it was impossible. Yet there was something in Elizabeth's wide, trusting grin that reminded her of Daniel's open-hearted warmth. The pastor, not Nora's father, who had refused to attend despite being informed of the marriage, spoke the traditional words with solemnity. When it came time for the vows, Daniel's voice rang out clear and strong, his promises to love, honor, and cherish extending explicitly to Elizabeth as well as Nora. I take you both as my family, he added, departing from the traditional text. From this day forward, Elizabeth is my daughter in every way that matters. Tears blurred Nora's vision as she made her own vows, her voice trembling with emotion but never faltering. When Daniel slipped his mother's gold band onto her finger, it felt like the completion of a circle of family broken by death now renewed through love. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the pastor declared. You may kiss your bride. Daniel's kiss was gentle but full of promise, mindful of Elizabeth between them but leaving no doubt about his feelings for his new wife. The wedding breakfast that followed at the town's small hotel was a joyous affair, with Mrs. Rivera presiding over a feast she had spent days preparing. There were toasts and well wishes, gifts both practical and sentimental, and a general atmosphere of celebration that warmed Nora's heart. Not everyone was welcoming. She caught whispers and sidelong glances from some of the townspeople who remembered her disgrace, but the open approval of the Ericksons and Daniel's other neighbors went a long way toward easing the sting of judgment. They were preparing to leave when a commotion at the hotel entrance drew everyone's attention. Nora's heart sank as she recognized her father's tall, austere figure standing in the doorway, his expression severe as his gaze found her across the room. "Continue with the celebrations," Daniel murmured to Mrs. Rivera before placing a protective hand at the small of Nora's back. "Would you like me to ask him to leave?" Nora shook her head, squaring her shoulders. "No. I should speak with him." With Daniel beside her, Elizabeth cradled in her arms, Nora approached her father. Up close, she was struck by how much he had aged in the months since she'd last seen him, his hair grayer, the lines in his face deeper, his tall frame somehow diminished. "Father," she greeted him, keeping her voice steady. "Nora," he replied, his gaze moving from her face to Elizabeth, then to Daniel. "Mr. Blackwood." "Reverend Sullivan," Daniel acknowledged with a respectful nod. "We're honored you could attend, though I'm sorry it's only at the end of the celebration." "I did not come to celebrate," Nora's father said stiffly. "I came to speak with my daughter." Daniel's hand tightened slightly at Nora's waist. "Anything you have to say to my wife can be said to both of us." Something flickered in the older man's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at Daniel's protective stance. "Very well. I received a visit from a man claiming to be the father of Nora's child. A Mr. Walker." "We're aware," Daniel replied. "He came to the ranch some weeks ago. He has returned to Silver Creek," Nora's father continued. "He is displeased to learn of your marriage. He has been making certain claims about his prior relationship with Nora and his rights to the child." Fear clutched at Nora's heart, but Daniel's steady presence kept her from showing it. "What sort of claims?" she asked. "He suggests there was an understanding between you, a promise of marriage. He implies that the child," her father faltered, clearly uncomfortable. "That I seduced your daughter?" Daniel finished for him, his voice hard. "That Elizabeth is my child, conceived before marriage, and Nora invented the story of Walker to cover our indiscretion?" Nora gasped at the audacity of the lie, but her father's expression confirmed that this was indeed what Thomas had claimed. "It's not true," she said vehemently. "I never even met Daniel until after Thomas abandoned me. Elizabeth is Thomas Walker's child, though she will be Daniel's daughter in every way that matters from today forward." Her father studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Daniel. "I believe you," he said finally. "Walker's story had too many inconsistencies. And he was overly interested in what property you might possess, Mr. Blackwood." "Thomas has never cared about Elizabeth," Nora said bitterly. "Only what he might gain by claiming her." "Yes, I see that now," her father admitted. He hesitated, then added, "I should have seen it sooner. Should have believed you when you said he had promised marriage." The admission, the closest thing to an apology Nora had ever heard from her proud father, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Father," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. "No," he interrupted, raising a hand. "I was wrong, Nora. In my concern for your soul and the reputation of our family, I forgot the most fundamental teaching of our Lord, compassion. I failed you when you needed me most." He glanced at Elizabeth, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "And I have been denied these months with my granddaughter as a result." The acknowledgement of Elizabeth as his granddaughter the first time he had claimed any connection to her broke something open in Nora's heart. "Would you like to hold her?" she offered, her voice thick with emotion. Surprise flickered across her father's austere features, followed by a hesitant nod. With gentle care, Nora placed Elizabeth in his arms, showing him how to support her head. The baby looked up at this new face with curious green eyes, then broke into a gummy smile that transformed her small features. "She has your mother's eyes," her father said softly, an unexpected catch in his voice. "And her smile." "Yes," Nora agreed, her own voice unsteady. "I've always thought so." For a moment, the years of strictness and disappointment between them seemed to recede, replaced by the simple bond of family, a grandfather meeting his grandchild for the first time. "Walker will not trouble you again," her father said after a moment, reluctantly handing Elizabeth back to Nora. "I've made it clear to him that any further false claims will result in charges of fraud. He left town this morning, headed east from what I understand." Relief washed over Nora. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "It was the least I could do," her father replied. He turned to Daniel, his expression grave. "Take care of them, Mr. Blackwood. They deserve a good man." "I intend to, sir," Daniel assured him. "Every day of my life." Her father nodded once, then, after a moment's hesitation, leaned forward to place a feather-light kiss on Nora's forehead, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "Be happy, daughter," he whispered before straightening and turning to leave. "Father," Nora called after him, "will you visit us? At the ranch? To see Elizabeth grow?" He paused, looking back with an expression she couldn't quite read. "If I would be welcome." "You would," Daniel answered for both of them. "Family is always welcome in our home." A faint smile, the first Nora had seen on his face in years, touched her father's lips. "Then perhaps I shall, come summer." With a final nod, he departed, his tall figure disappearing through the hotel doors. Nora turned to Daniel, overwhelmed by the unexpected reconciliation. "Did that really just happen?" "It did," he confirmed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Elizabeth works magic on everyone she meets. Even stern ministers." Nora laughed softly, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for not sending him away. For giving him a chance. He's your father," Daniel said simply. "And Elizabeth's grandfather. Family is too precious to turn away, even when they've made mistakes." The wisdom in his words, the generosity of spirit they revealed, reinforced Nora's certainty that she had married a truly good man. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now. "More than I can say." Daniel's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "And I love you, Mrs. Blackwood. Both of you." He glanced around at their wedding guests, who were politely pretending not to observe the family drama that had just unfolded. "What do you say we thank our friends and head home? I believe we have a marriage to begin." Home. The word held new meaning now, not just a place of shelter, but the center of a life they would build together, the three of them. Nora nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Yes," she agreed. "Let's go home." Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the Blackwood ranch, turning the rolling pastures golden and warming the wooden porch where Nora sat shelling peas. From her vantage point, she could see Daniel in the corral, leading a small, dappled pony with 5-year-old Elizabeth perched proudly on its back. "Look, Mama!" Elizabeth called, waving with one hand while the other clutched the pony's mane. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see, sweetheart," Nora called back, smiling at her daughter's excitement. "You're doing wonderfully." Daniel looked up at Nora's voice, his face breaking into the warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. He said something to Elizabeth, then led the pony in a careful circle, never letting go of the lead rope despite their daughter's pleas to go faster, Papa. The sound of gurgling laughter drew Nora's attention to the wooden cradle beside her chair. 3-month-old James Daniel Blackwood was awake from his nap, his blue eyes so like his father's bright with infant curiosity, as he waved his chubby fists at the shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow on the porch ceiling. "Hello, little man," Nora said, setting aside her peas to lift the baby into her arms. "Did you have a good sleep?" James responded with a toothless grin that never failed to melt her heart. He was the image of Daniel, from his dark hair to the dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced a visitor. Nora looked up to see a familiar figure riding up the drive, her father, his weekly visit right on schedule. In the years since her wedding, a careful reconciliation had taken place between Nora and Reverend Sullivan. It had begun with those promised summer visits to see Elizabeth, gradually increasing in frequency until he was a regular presence in their lives. He remained somewhat formal and reserved by nature, but his devotion to his grandchildren was unmistakable. Elizabeth spotted him first. "Grandfather!" she shouted, immediately losing interest in her riding lesson. "Grandfather's here!" Daniel obligingly lifted her from the pony, setting her on her feet so she could run to meet the approaching rider. Nora watched with a full heart as her father dismounted and swept Elizabeth into his arms with a warmth he had rarely shown during Nora's own childhood. "How is my favorite horsewoman today?" he asked, carrying Elizabeth toward the house. "Papa is teaching me to ride Pepper all by myself," Elizabeth informed him importantly. "And I didn't fall off even once." "Impressive," her grandfather said seriously. "Perhaps you'll ride to town with me someday soon." As they reached the porch, Reverend Sullivan's gaze softened at the sight of Nora with baby James in her arms. "Daughter," he greeted her. "The boy is growing like a weed." "He is," Nora agreed, rising to accept her father's brief but affectionate embrace. "He's almost outgrowing his cradle already." "Strong Blackwood stock," Daniel commented as he joined them, having seen to the pony's care. He extended his hand to his father-in-law, their initial wariness long since replaced by mutual respect. "Good to see you, Reverend. Will you stay for supper? Mrs. Rivera is making her famous beef stew." "I'd be delighted," Reverend Sullivan replied. "I brought apple tarts from Mrs. Jensen at the bakery. She sends her regards." As they settled on the porch, Elizabeth climbing into her grandfather's lap to show him a book she'd been learning to read, Nora felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was the family she had never dared to dream of during those dark days after her banishment from Silver Creek. A loving husband, 2 beautiful children, even a reconciliation with her father. Daniel caught her eye over Elizabeth's animated storytelling, his expression softening in the way reserved only for her. He crossed to her side, placing a gentle hand on James's downy head before leaning down to press a kiss to Nora's temple. "Happy?" he murmured. Nora leaned into his touch, grateful beyond words for the man who had welcomed her and Elizabeth into his home and his heart when they had nowhere else to turn. "Completely," she whispered back. And it was true. The pain of the past had not been erased. There were still whispers in town sometimes, curious glances at Elizabeth's red hair so unlike her parents', but it had been transformed, becoming part of a larger story of redemption and love. As the afternoon light gilded the landscape and the voices of her family rose and fell around her, Nora reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her here. She had been cast out, alone and afraid, carrying a child she had no means to support. But in her darkest hour, she had found more than mere shelter. She had found a home filled with love, and a man whose heart was big enough to embrace both her and her child as his own. Some might call it luck or coincidence. Nora, watching her husband swing their daughter into the air while her father looked on with a rare smile, preferred to think of it as grace, unexpected, undeserved, but transformative in its power to heal and create new beginnings from the ashes of the old. "Mama, come see what grandfather brought me," Elizabeth called, breaking into Nora's reflections. With James settled securely in one arm, Nora rose to join her family, stepping willingly into the circle of love that had become her greatest blessing. The past with all its pain could not be changed, but the future bright with promise and possibility stretched before them like the vast Montana sky, boundless and full of hope.